What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to America Trends. John Krofsik, Larry Rifkin. And can you get the policy right when the process is broken, John? And I know there have been a lot of people talking about that lately as a lead up to the 2020 election. In other words, before we worry about one individual policy or another, why don't we make certain that we don't have gerrymandered districts, that we don't have inordinate impact from money on political campaigns? Because if we don't get that right, the underpinnings, then none of the other stuff can get done.
Not to mention, we got to have voting machines that have paper ballots. A lot of states don't even have that, so they can't even do a proper recount. I mean, we have a lot of problems.
Well, we want fair, free elections. We do want elections that are not all doused in money, such that we have a lesser impact with our political voice than other people do. I mean, there's lots of things in America that are a bit askew. Now, the Democrats in the House this year, John, they started their legislative session by passing legislation to fix a lot of these issues.
Well, I
now,
don't know if it actually passed. That was H.R. 1 you're
right.
talking about?
Well, it passed the House.
Well, no. Only a little piece of it passed.
Really?
Which is better, but...
Now, what were you listening to?
I was listening to Jen Briney's podcast.
Only part of it passed.
Yes, she was very disappointed. She was in tears that this didn't pass because, like you're talking about, she wants elections that are good, but the Democrats really didn't want this to happen. So I forget what little part happened, but we should have her on to talk about it.
We can have her on, but let's be honest about it. Even if it all passed the House, it was going nowhere in Mitch McConnell's Senate.
Right.
So it doesn't really matter. But let's give her a plug.
Yeah.
Well, remind people. She's a friend of ours.
Congressional Dish. Yeah, you got to listen to it. Jen Briney.
Yeah, she does a great job. She really does.
Congressionaldish.com.
She kind of got us into podcasting in many ways. So
thanks,
Jen. Yeah, you're great. But they were trying, in some sense, to lay a marker down, saying that the foundation upon which better politics is built has got to be the first order of business before you get to all these other issues. So,
yes, absolutely. That's absolutely true.
But what's interesting is that the right in America has understood the importance of, shall we say, making the rules work for them and gerrymandering. And our next guest describes how this approach to achieving political power and holding on to it goes way back to the 1970s. And it actually goes back to a memo that someone who we began to know later on in his career, not when he was a corporate lawyer, but when he became a U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Lewis Powell, who was really upset because at the time that he wrote this memo to fellow conservatives and the GOP saying, hey, we're starting to get our clock cleaned here by environmentalists, by those who want OSHA regulation. We've got to fight back. So he developed an entire strategy for the GOP that evidently they have followed almost religiously like a playbook for many, many years. And it involved more right-wing media. It involved more state legislatures, a whole range of interests who would secure a benefit for the party, while the Democrats were a lot more fractured. And so in the book, The Democracy Fix, Caroline Fredrickson talks about what the Republicans did and what will the Democrats do to respond to it, if anything. Now, that H.R. 1 was one of their responses, but evidently that's been neutered.
Yeah, according from what I heard is that they kind of self-destructed it themselves. I think they sabotaged it themselves because it was a really good bill, and it would have taken care of a lot of the money that illegally is being
finds
passed
its way
yes.
quietly. Without transparency, yes.
But they put the bill up before it was ready, and it was kind of self-destructing.
All right. Well, the Republicans, on the other hand, they've been pushing back hard on many of the initiatives that the Democrats have put forward throughout the 20th century. And whenever we've had an interesting, expansion of government, whether it be Social Security or Medicare or voting rights, the Democrats have usually been in the forefront. So how do you push back? Well, you do it in elections. You do it by controlling more aspects of the media, like Fox News. You do it with think tanks, and there are many conservative think tanks, and you do it in Congress and state legislatures. They've been more successful in the recent period in doing that. So Caroline Fredrickson, who's more progressive, wants to see a Democratic response to what's been going on. That's why she wrote the book and is very involved in this process, and that's why we brought her to our microphones to talk about how they might try to level the playing field.
Well, it's about time.
All right, let's go to it now on America Trends. With us on the line is Caroline Fredrickson. The book is called The Democracy Fix. And Caroline, it's really a fascinating book. And I had never put into perspective the fact that Republicans, over this period, I did know a lot about Operation Red Map, but I never really thought contextually about how many things they were doing to ensure power first, policy next, and ensuring that they were building something that was long-standing and sustainable in terms of affecting a whole range of institutions across the country. I just never really put it all together until reading your book, The Democracy Fix.
Well, I hadn't really either until I started doing my research. I mean, I was really, well aware that there had been a lot more sustained engagement and investment in certain kinds of institutions on the right. But when I went back and looked at the history, and I saw that, in fact, this was incredibly well planned, that they had a roadmap to victory, and they followed it very methodically. Karl Rove with his Red Map was just one manifestation of their efforts. But, they looked at, the sort of the landscape of power. There are elected leaders in the legislatures, Congress and state houses, governors and presidents. There is the world of ideas, think tanks and universities, and there's media, and then there are the courts. And they decided that they needed to make sure they were controlling as much of those as they possibly could and do it in a way that was for the long term. And when they got power, they changed the rules to lock in power. And we could talk about the history of that.
I want to with
memo.
The Powell memo. I mean, because
Exactly.
That was a revelation to me as well. Because when I think of Lewis Powell, I think of him on the U.S. Supreme Court, and I don't think of him as, quote unquote, a political operative. But in many ways, I mean, he is the progenitor of a lot of what Republicans have done to ensure longstanding power.
That's right. And when you go a little bit back, before he became a Supreme Court justice, he was a tobacco lawyer. But most importantly, really, he was very active with the Chamber of Commerce. And he had this idea that in the early 70s, that this capitalism was under dire threat. And he saw this in part because, Ralph Nader and other crusading lawyers were actually having some victories against corporate America due to extremely dangerous products, cars that had gas tanks that blew up, and things that actually, I think we're all really happy that he had such success and that there have been some improvements, although not enough. But it was also the environmental movement, and it's the time when Earth Day was sort of first launched. People were marching. Even President Nixon had to take action, and he set up the Environmental Protection Administration, and Congress adopted clean air standards. And so, Lewis Powell, wrote this memo that was shared with the chamber's leadership and with the bigwigs in corporate America that basically said, we need to fight this, and we need to do it through a long-standing and engaged investment in these major institutions. And he laid it all out. I mean, it's about a 40-page memo. It's not very hard for anybody to sit down and read. It was visionary. He found a deep well of agreement in corporate America, and they launched this effort, and, here we are.
But why is it that they were able to sustain this because political parties today, it can be argued, and Ian Shapiro, who did a podcast with us from Yale, has argued that the parties are not that strong any longer. Maybe the movement people are still strong, particularly on the right, but parties, as we can see, where the Democrats have 20 choices, and who's going to broker the decision as to who gets the nomination. In the old days, it would have been a power broker of some sort. So how have they been able to sustain all this energy, both in the intellectual world, in terms of these think tanks, in terms of writing documentation and legislation through this group called ALEC, the ability to control justices through the Federalist Society? How have they been able to be that determined about all of these things and keep it going? I mean, what's the framework for keeping all this going?
It is kind of impressive, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
So the framework is in part that it's a very hierarchical situation. But one of I think the problems we have on the left, and one of the reasons we, probably like being on the left, is we are much more diverse, and we are, people come from different backgrounds and have, the issue passion they have may be different than some of their fellow progressives. So we have to make common cause across a much wider spectrum of issues and backgrounds, life experiences. And on the right, it's a much more cohesive group. It's very top-down, and very much has been run by, the chamber and their plutocrats. The Koch brothers and the others have really, when you look at how the funding has worked on the right, you see a small group of really big players, the Bradleys and the Mercers and the Koch brothers, who fund a lot of similar organizations or the same organization, and they decide, it's like they're putting their money on the Federalist Society, the Heritage Foundation, and they just say we're doing it for the long term. We don't expect immediate results because we know that this kind of change is incremental. It's only going to happen if we actually are in it for the long term. And so they were able to sustain that. And one of the critiques I have on the left is that from, particularly, sort of the on the funding side, even foundations and major donors and those who actually, are the sustaining basis for activism on the left. I mean, grassroots, don't just exist. There's actually a structure that needs to be supported. And so, there's, that piece of it's really important, but they are much more, let's just say, short-term in their vision, sometimes laughably short-term, expecting results in, 3 months or 6 months. The idea that, there's an idea for, that they're focused on 10 years from now, is just not happening. To pull that together.
However, from a policy standpoint, if we look at a lot of the major changes that have occurred in our society in the 20th century, and we can trace it back to Social Security, we can go back to Medicare, Medicaid, Voting Rights Act, we can look at the Affordable Care Act, and oftentimes the Republicans are pushing against ideas that have become part of the mainstream as a result of Democratic initiatives. The Democrats have been, I think, historically, the governing party in America in terms of moving us along from a policy standpoint. So they've been very effective, the Democrats, with policy. And so what are these Republicans, those who sustain the impact from the Lewis Powell letter, the Karl Roves, the Lee Atwaters, they keep pushing back against the tide, what seems to be a progressive movement and history in America, assigning more rights to more groups and the like. So are they kind of still swimming upstream, or are they really in control? I'm trying to figure out where the real power dynamic is in terms of policy, even though they have a lot of the levers of government at this moment in time.
Well, I mean, I have to say, I think I have to disagree with you to some extent, and some of it is looking at, you mentioned the Voting Rights Act. So that was passed in 1965. In the Shelby County decision, the Supreme Court just ripped the heart out of it.
Right. And Section 5.
There's been a massive effort to engage in voter suppression before Shelby County, but it has been accelerated by the Shelby County decision, which really gave the green light to states like North Carolina and Texas and so many others to re-up their laws that had been blocked before that have made it so much harder for people to vote, for people of color particularly. Citizens United, which unleashed huge amounts of campaign money into campaigns. So certainly on the side of the courts, they have been enormously effective. And it's not just the substantive decisions, but in the democracy fix, I have, discussion that I think is important that we on the left don't pay a lot of attention to. It's the rules by which the courts operate. Mm-hmm. So in that case, you have barriers that get erected that mean that it's really hard to actually enforce the laws that were passed. So that is even where you don't have a situation like Shelby County, which was a direct assault on the heart of the Voting Rights Act. You have a whole series of both court decisions, but also rules that have been issued by the courts, as well as efforts by legislatures that block people from getting in the door. So that means if your rights have been violated as a worker, or if you've been discriminated against, or if there's pollution, all of the mechanisms, not all, but so many of them that have allowed us to enforce our rights are now stripped away. So you could say it's a very backdoor effort to repeal the policy victories of the left, but it's happened. I mean, imagine, you are harmed as a worker because your company takes $1 out of your wage every hour. That's not a lot of money in the grand scheme of things. It's a lot of money to you, though, if you're a minimum wage worker. But the ability of low-wage workers now to join together collectively in a class action has been, kneecapped because of a variety of rulings of the Supreme Court, spurred on by the Chamber of Commerce. The big Walmart case is one example of that. So, I guess I'd have to say, they're very clever, and I talk about that in the book as well, they were very cognizant that sometimes things are better done in the dark of night than under the light of the media and in the public eye. And when it's easier to destroy a statute by making it unenforceable than it is to do it directly by repealing it.
And the Democrats, I mean, first of all, you remind us that they shouldn't think that they can overcome a lot of this by taking on all the same tactics in terms of being funded by plutocrats and a whole range of things that you don't want them to fall into. But I have a question, and maybe you can explain it to me, because I'm having a hard time figuring out how it happened, because you talk about the combination of dark money, voter suppression, gerrymandering, and I mean, I agree with you about all of these things, particularly the gerrymandering that took place after the census in 2010. How do you explain the fact that I never thought the U.S. House of Representatives, until there was a new census, could really ever turn back to the Democrats, given the effective Operation Red Map? So what happened in 2018? Are the Democrats starting to figure this out, or is it just such a hatred of what Donald Trump did in his first 2 years?
Yeah, it was a wave. And actually Democrats should have a lot more seats in the House, but for Red Map. And I'll give you an example. In North Carolina, there are 13 congressional seats. The Democrats in this election won almost 50% of the vote in North Carolina. 48.4 or something, and the Republicans won 51. Of those 13 seats, the Democrats got only 3.
Only 3, yeah. Well, we've seen those kinds of numbers in Ohio where Democrats get 1 million more votes, and because of the gerrymandering, they end up with 3 seats and the Republicans 10. But how could this turn in 2018? I mean, it seems remarkable still.
Yeah, well, there was such people were so energized by the need to reform and push back on Donald Trump and where the Republican Party has been taking this country. I think, there are so many issues that got people to go vote. It was just a real high turnout. And, we all hope that people think that every election should be just as important and they should go and vote. But nonetheless, they were pushing against, a barrier that had been erected.
Oh, absolutely.
There would be a much larger majority for Nancy Pelosi, for the Democrats, were there not, these gerrymandered districts. So it's I think it's fortunate in so many ways, because otherwise, imagine how unleashed Donald Trump would be. But it still, doesn't represent what the voters had wanted.
Well, let's talk about power preceding policy, because, the power differential can be reversed, and I know that there are efforts to do that, to learn from Operation Red Map and make certain that the Democrats are not hoodwinked or not lulled to sleep, focus so much on policy that they don't understand that power has to be attained first. Are there Democrats talking about process, or is it hard to get that message to ignite people? What is the reason, and why are the Democrats now, given what you have cataloged in your book about the way the Republicans have gone about this, are the Democrats taking this seriously enough?
I think they're starting to. I do. I think, there's been somewhat of a wake-up call. I was really pleased with the first bill that was introduced by the House Democrats, H.R. 1, which in some ways, an analog to my book, it lays out sort of major issues of infrastructure that need to be addressed, from election administration to ethics reforms, as well as money in politics. It does discuss a little bit the court system. That needs, a much greater attention from Democrats. But it still is, I think, a recognition that, we can't piecemeal this. We cannot, everything else really follows. I think we're all so concerned about climate change and so worried about what's happening to the earth and to our oceans and gun violence and all sorts of other police brutality and so forth. There are so many issues that are we need to address. But if we always lose elections because there's voter suppression and the plutocrats are swamping the airwaves with dark money run ads, all that debate about the policy nuances is just wasted breath.
Well, you provide a public memorandum to progressive Americans. Maybe it's the antidote to the long available Powell memo. And tell us what you think among the prescriptions that you're offering and suggesting that the Democrats or progressives should be focused on rapidly, perhaps even in advance of the 2020 election, to make certain that their message is there and that power can be reassumed. What is it that they could do most quickly and effectively?
Number one, and these are things that can and should happen at the state and local level as well, because a lot of election administration is state. And the state houses are where redistricting happens. So, number one, we need to make sure that the election systems are fair. We need to have early voting expansion. We need to have same-day voter registration, automatic voter registration. Voting needs to be easy. It shouldn't be, we shouldn't have to climb over many hurdles. Eligible voters should be able to vote, and we should make it easy. We're a democracy after all. We need to address money in politics through, a couple of different avenues that are effective. We can't, until we get the Supreme Court back and fix Citizens United, we can't do everything that needs to be done. Transparency. The Disclose Act, which is also part of H.R. 1, who's running those attack ads? what are the dark money group? Who's behind their financing? That needs to be addressed. There's, a lot of localities and states, at least some of them are adopting rules around low donor matches in campaigns, campaign donations, which is a way of countering the effect of big money through little money, but lots of little money. So I think, those are a couple issues. Dealing with the Electoral College through the National Popular Vote, which is a way of countering what I think is the gerrymandering of the presidential election. And then engaging on the courts. And that is, basically, we need the left to care. And that means pressuring senators, including Democrats, to actually pay attention and put some of their fight the battle. Right now, we're seeing a whole wave of Trump nominees who are frightening in how extreme they are in their right-wing views, and the Democrats have just never really been nearly as engaged.
Well, let's go back to that, because I think that's a really important issue. There's no question that the Federalist Society, with Don McGahn, who plays a very interesting role in a lot of elements of the Trump administration, along with Mitch McConnell, who says he's still got his wrecking ball out for liberal policies, but his focus has been on the courts. And he and Donald Trump, when you talk about things that have been done very quietly in the democracy fix, This is one of them. And you say that they have developed a real farm system of lawyers and others. Where have the Democrats been? I mean, in terms of developing their own bench, and who in the Senate really helped to make it easy to get these nominations through, such that the Democrats now can only rue whatever changes have gone on in the rules process. And how do you begin to address this when these are lifetime appointments to the district courts and the appellate courts?
Well, absolutely. It's a great question. And I'd say, one of the things that people have to realize is that this is exactly the kind of investment that is really for the long term. Mm-hmm. And on the right, they knew that, you start with a law student and you end up with a Supreme Court justice. Hello, Brett Kavanaugh. It's a process that takes cultivation and nurturing throughout somebody's career. We do that, and we are trying to build that through the American Constitution Society. It's making sure that young progressive law students and lawyers are supported and helped through the process of getting jobs and getting clerkships and meeting the right people who are going to help them through, and making sure that's a diverse group, people who come from all sorts of backgrounds and also have practiced in a variety of different areas. I mean, we need to have more than prosecutors and corporate lawyers on the bench. We need public defenders and labor lawyers. We need people who've worked with criminal defendants and workers and understand the real life issues that face them. So, part of it is just having the same horizon. I mean, this stuff takes a long time, and we're doing it, but we're also working with our partner organizations right now in the communities to find who are the people who should be putting their names in the hopper and getting them ready. It's something that just can't be done. You don't just turn a switch on.
Right.
And I think that's been the failing on the left, is that we have not prepared in the past, and we need to do a whole lot better now.
Do people on the left think that maybe the presidency of Donald Trump, where I believe a lot of what happened in 2018 was not only Democrats being more energized, but Republicans in the suburbs, and particularly women, saying, I don't want any part of whatever this is, or the sense that demographics are moving many states more from red to purple to blue? Are Democrats going to potentially fall into this vulnerable place where they think that time alone, without organization, is going to settle things thanks to Trump and thanks to the demographics? Is that a possibility, that they think they don't have to do the hard work?
Yeah, I worry about that a lot. I mean, it's happened for a while. I mean, there were a lot of, people prognosticating that, Democrats would have the upper hand forever and, let's sit back and see it happen. But in fact, there are two components to this. One is voting is really hard. And those groups, those demographic changes, those groups that are part of that, are facing real impediments to voting, because on the right they recognize that demography or demographics could be destiny if they let it be, and they've decided not to by rigging the elections. But even if you get the elections to be fair and so that people who are eligible are voting, you have to get them to the polling booth. You've got to actually get them there and encourage them and make them enthusiastic. And so those are, two pieces of the puzzle that Democrats need to deal with. My book is mostly about the former, about making sure that the system is not rigged. But then there's got to be, the enthusiasm and the excitement for what the Democrats would do has to be supplied by the candidates. We need to do that too. I think, speaking to people, about what their real problems are in terms of the economy and in terms of their lives and health care. I think, that's not my business, not exactly what I do, but I think it's clear, what the people are saying. But I share that concern that people on the left can be complacent.
You say that the GOP can't win on policy, thus they change the rules. Can Democrats win on policy even with the rules that have been put in place, in many cases very effectively, if not clandestinely, by the Republicans?
Challenge, right? I mean, I think, we've got to use every tool in our toolbox to figure out how to push back on the rigging. I think, there are short-term responses that may require, a partisan approach. I think, in advance of redistricting in places where a ballot initiative isn't possible, to set up nonpartisan a nonpartisan redistricting commission, needed the Democrats to take over the state house, and then they need to be pressured to actually adopt a nonpartisan system. But I think it's going to require real commitment, though, in all of these areas, because they all work together.
Have you seen, for example, any impact yet from the National Democratic Redistricting Committee that President Obama and Eric Holder have gotten behind? Is that really the direct response to Operation Red Map? Because it's all coming up again, the census, and a lot of changeover in state houses and in legislatures. Is this a critical moment in time as you look at it?
It's absolutely a critical factor. And, I think on the Republican side, they are anticipating and trying to block what Eric Holder is trying to do. And it's a little too early to see if they're going to be successful, because it will only know based on what happens in the next election. What Karl Rove did is, he identified the seats that they needed to flip in the state houses that they needed to take over, where there was a Republican governor, so that they could adopt a map, make sure that the redistricting happened in such a way that it was credibly favorable to Republicans, illegitimately favorable to Republicans. I don't think that's what Eric Holder's trying to do, but I think they're trying to set up a system where Democrats will win in the state houses to set up, and he even says, set up nonpartisan redistricting as much as possible. I think, for progressives, our values are that, the politicians shouldn't be choosing their voters. The voters should choose their politicians. And that's what fair districts actually do. So I think our voters and our values support that. But then I think it's also because that system works better to represent the majority, and we were just talking about demographics and sort of the changing nature of America. I actually think fair districts are going to mean that when people's votes are actually represented, achieve success in getting representatives of their choosing, then those people are likely to be progressives, because that's where the nation is going.
Well, I love the subtitle, How to Win the Fight for Fair Rules, Fair Courts, and Fair Elections. It will be really interesting, Caroline Fredrickson, to see whether candidates really start talking about these process issues. And you did it in your book, because I found a lot of the information really enlightening and interesting. It will be fascinating to see whether any of these candidates can talk about these issues with a certain level of passion to ensure that the public knows that this stuff is really important, as are the other substantive issues that most of these campaigns revolve around.
Well, I certainly hope so, and it's time that we did that on the left, and we need to embrace the process, because the process is what it's all about. That is, in fact, democracy.
Or do it quietly the way the Republicans have. Because I think if you asked a lot of Republican voters, tell me about the impact of ALEC on various policies and legislation within the courts, within the legislatures in your state, they would have no idea what ALEC is. And yet ALEC is writing a lot of this legislation. I mean, they probably don't even understand a lot of the things that have been going on that they might look in hindsight and say, I'm glad that it did, but it wasn't formally announced. Do you think the Democrats...
No, that's very true. That's very true. You can sort of decouple your policy, your platform and your election from, what you're committed to doing, along the way, consistently and for the long term.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, that's right. That's right. And in fact, there's a section in my book where I talk about the sort of the bargain that was made between the Christian conservatives, the Jerry Falwell and the others, the moral majority, and the Chamber of Commerce. And basically, they recognize that you don't go and appeal to people based on tax policy for the wealthy, but you reach out to them on issues like abortion and school prayer, basically the kind of racial anxieties that Reagan was so good at exploiting to create, the Reagan Democrat. In the meantime, though, they are engaging in gerrymandering and voter suppression and all of that. So no, you're right. It's actually the way that it has to be done.
Caroline Fredrickson, The Democracy Fix. Thank you so much for coming by today on America Trends.
Hey, it was a real pleasure. I enjoyed it.
America Trends Podcast is part of the MHNR Network, mhnrnetwork.com.